It's strange how life can change completely in just 1 year. As I sit here in my new apartment, looking out at the city lights, I barely recognize the person I was 12 months ago. The guy who doubted himself, who let others make him question his own reality. He feels like a stranger now. The divorce was finalized 3 months ago. I remember walking out of the courthouse feeling lighter, like I'd finally put down a heavy backpack I'd been carrying for too long. My sister was waiting outside with a small smile. "Let's get lunch," she said, like it was just another Tuesday. Sometimes the biggest moments in our lives need to be marked with small, normal things. I heard through mutual friends that my ex-wife and Alex's relationship imploded spectacularly about 2 months after everything came out. Turns out, relationships built on lies don't have very strong foundations. They tried dating openly for a while, but the trust issues were too much. How can you trust someone when you know exactly what they're capable of? Alex's wife, well, ex-wife now, has become a good friend. We meet for coffee every few weeks, but not at that cafe downtown. Never there. We talk about our new lives, our healing processes, sometimes even laugh about how blind we've been. "We should have compared notes sooner," she often jokes. There's no romantic interest there. We're just two people who understand each other's scars. The friendship group eventually settled into new patterns. Some friends drifted away, unable to handle the awkwardness of choosing sides. Others grew closer, showing up with takeout food on hard days or dragging me out when I needed distraction. I learned who my real friends were, the ones who'd suspected something was wrong, but didn't know how to tell me, and who now made up for it by being there for the aftermath. Work became my sanctuary in those early days, but eventually I found other ways to rebuild. I joined a local hiking group, started taking cooking classes. Turns out I'm terrible at it, but it's fun. Began reading all those books I'd been meaning to get to. Slowly, I started filling my life with new experiences that had nothing to do with my past. My ex-wife still tries to reach out sometimes. Last month, she sent a long email about how sorry she was, how much she'd grown, how she'd been in therapy working on herself. I read it, acknowledged it, but didn't respond. Some bridges, once burned, shouldn't be rebuilt. It's not about anger anymore. I'm just not interested in being part of her journey of self-discovery. The hardest lesson was learning to trust my instincts again. For months after the divorce, I found myself second-guessing everything, wondering if I was being paranoid in new situations. But slowly, I realized that the problem had never been my instincts. They'd been right all along. The problem was that I'd let others convince me not to trust them. Recently, I started dating again. Nothing serious yet, just coffee meetups and casual conversations. It's different this time. I'm different. I know what red flags look like now, and I'm not afraid to acknowledge them. More importantly, I know what it feels like to trust my gut when it tells me something isn't right. My new apartment is smaller than our old house, but it's mine. Every piece of furniture, every picture on the wall, I chose them all. There's something empowering about building a space that's completely yours, about not having to consider anyone else's preferences or memories. The other day, I found an old photo of all of us. Me, my ex-wife, Alex, his ex-wife, our whole friend group, at a barbecue from 2 years ago. Everyone was smiling, looking happy, normal. I studied it for a long time, trying to see if there were any signs of what was to come. But that's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't always show up in photos. I keep that picture not to torture myself, but as a reminder. A reminder that it's okay to trust people, but it's essential to trust yourself first. A reminder that sometimes the most painful endings lead to the most necessary beginnings. A reminder that being called possessive for noticing real problems says more about the person doing the gaslighting than the person being gaslit. Looking back now, I realize that surviving betrayal isn't just about getting through the pain. It's about learning from it without becoming bitter. It's about understanding that while some people might try to make you doubt your reality, your truth is still your truth. Most importantly, it's about realizing that sometimes losing people who don't respect you is the beginning of finding yourself. They say moving out of the house you shared with your spouse feels like leaving a piece of yourself behind. I didn't really understand that until I stood in our bedroom, packing my life into cardboard boxes. Each item held a memory, some good, some now tainted by everything that had happened. My sister offered me her spare room while I figured things out. "Stay as long as you need," she said, helping me carry boxes up the narrow staircase. I could tell she wanted to say more, to tell me how she'd never trusted my wife, but she held back. Sometimes silence is the best support you can offer. The first few days were the hardest. I'd wake up reaching for someone who wasn't there, then remember everything all over again. My phone would light up with notifications, my wife's desperate attempts to explain, to apologize, to beg for another chance. Each message felt like reopening a wound that was trying to heal. I threw myself into work, staying late at the office just to avoid going back to my sister's place. My coworkers treaded carefully around me like I was made of glass. Word had gotten around. It always does in small offices. Some tried to help by sharing their own stories of betrayal and recovery. Others just left coffee on my desk without saying a word. Both kinds of support meant more than they knew. The divorce lawyers spoke a language of their own. Terms like asset division and dissolution of marriage made everything feel cold and clinical. My lawyer suggested I document everything: the cafe photos, the text messages, the timeline of their affair. Looking at it all laid out in legal documents made it feel both more real and somehow more distant, like reading about someone else's life falling apart. My wife's attempts to reconcile became more desperate. She'd show up at my workplace with tears in her eyes, trying to explain how sorry she was, how she'd made a terrible mistake. Each time, I'd feel that pull, that urge to believe her, to try to fix things. But then I'd remember those cafe photos, those months of lies, how they'd made me question my own sanity. One night, after a particularly rough day at work, I drove past our old house. Her car was in the driveway, but there was another car I didn't recognize. Through the living room window, I could see her sitting on our couch, talking to someone. For a moment, I felt that old familiar pain. Then I realized something. I didn't want to know who was in there with her. I didn't care anymore. The hardest part was dealing with shared friends. Some took sides immediately, while others tried to stay neutral. A few admitted they'd had suspicions, but hadn't known how to tell me. "We didn't want to get involved," they'd say, looking guilty. I understood, but it still hurt knowing how many people had seen what was happening, while I was still trying to convince myself I was wrong. Alex's wife and I kept in touch, supporting each other through the legal proceedings. There was something comforting about talking to someone who truly understood what I was going through. We'd meet for coffee sometimes, sharing updates about our separate divorces, warning each other about legal pitfalls we'd discovered. It wasn't friendship exactly, more like two survivors of the same disaster helping each other navigate the aftermath. My sister's spare room slowly became my space. I bought new sheets, rearranged the furniture, started building a life that was just mine. Some nights were still hard. I'd lie awake thinking about everything I'd lost, everything that had changed. But other nights, I'd feel something close to peace, knowing I was finally free from the weight of suspicion and lies. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning. Seeing our names typed out in cold, legal font, with boxes waiting for signatures that would end 6 years of marriage, it felt surreal. My lawyer had explained everything, outlined how the process would work, but nothing prepared me for how final it all looked on paper. My wife called when she got her copy. "Is this really what you want?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Can't we at least try counseling?" "We're not signing divorce papers because you had an affair," I told her. "We're signing them because you spent months making me think I was crazy for suspecting it. You and Alex didn't just betray my trust, you tried to break my grip on reality. That's not something counseling can fix." After I hung up, I sat in my car for a long time, watching the rain hit the windshield. 6 years of marriage, 15 years of friendship with Alex, all those shared memories and plans for the future, all of it washed away by their choices. But for the first time since this all began, I felt something like hope. Not happiness, not yet, but the possibility of it somewhere down the road. The truth has a way of spreading like wildfire once it starts. After sending that cafe photo to my wife, everything happened so fast it felt like watching dominoes fall. She called me 17 times that night, but I let each call go to voicemail. I needed time to think, to process, to plan my next steps without her trying to explain away the evidence again. The next morning, I woke up to a novel's worth of text messages. Some were from her, ranging from angry accusations to tearful apologies. Others were from Alex, claiming he wanted to explain everything. The most surprising ones came from his wife. She'd had no idea, and now her world was crumbling too. I'd finally agreed to meet my wife at a public park. Neutral territory, I thought. It was a sunny afternoon, almost offensively beautiful for such an ugly conversation. She was already there when I arrived, sitting on our usual bench near the duck pond. The same bench where we'd once planned our future together. How long? I'd ask as I sat down, keeping my distance. No hello, no small talk. I was done with the games. She stared at the pond for a long time before answering. 8 months, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. It started at the company retreat last summer. 8 months. I did the math in my head. While I was planning our anniversary trip, they were sneaking around behind my back. While I was defending her to my family, who'd noticed something was off, she was lying to everyone. 8 months of making me think I was losing my mind. The details came pouring out, like she'd been waiting for the chance to unburden herself. The stolen moments, the secret meetings, the elaborate systems they'd set up to hide their tracks. Each revelation felt like another twist of the knife, but I made myself listen. I needed to hear it all. I never meant for this to happen, she said, wiping tears from her eyes. It just happened. Things don't just happen, I replied, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. You make choices. Every secret meeting, every lie, every time you made me feel crazy for suspecting something, those were all choices. Meanwhile, my phone kept buzzing with messages from Alex. His wife had thrown him out, and apparently he was staying at a hotel. Good, I thought. Let him feel what displacement feels like. Let him experience the uncertainty he helped create in my life. Word spread through our friend group like a virus. People started taking sides, as people do. Some friends who'd witnessed their behavior over the past months came forward with their own observations. They'd seen things but hadn't wanted to get involved. I couldn't blame them, really, but it still hurt to know how many people had suspected something while I was still in the dark. The most surreal moment came when Alex's wife reached out to meet for coffee. She needed to talk to someone who understood what she was going through. We sat in a different cafe, not their usual spot, and shared our stories. It was like putting together a puzzle with pieces from 2 different boxes, seeing how our separate suspicions now formed a complete picture. I found hotel receipts, she told me, hands shaking around her coffee cup. Business trips that never happened. I confronted him last night, and he finally admitted everything. The aftermath rippled through every aspect of our lives. My wife moved out that weekend, taking only what she needed. I couldn't stand the thought of her packing while I was there, so I stayed at my brother's place. When I came back, half our photos were gone from the walls, leaving darker squares on the paint where they'd hung. The hardest part wasn't the pain or even the betrayal, it was realizing how expertly they'd manipulated everything. They'd used our trust against us, turned our concerns into proof of our own insecurities. They'd made us doubt ourselves while they carried on their affair in plain sight. Some nights, I'd lie awake wondering how I'd missed the signs for so long. But then I'd remember I hadn't missed them. I'd seen them all along. They'd just convinced me not to trust my own eyes, my own instincts. Never again, I promised myself. Never again would I let someone make me doubt what I knew in my gut to be true. As the dust began to settle, I found myself feeling something unexpected, relief. The weight of suspicion, of constant doubt, had lifted. Yes, my marriage was over, and one of my oldest friendships had been destroyed. But at least now I could see everything clearly. The truth, as painful as it was, felt better than all those months of uncertainty and gaslighting. Both of them kept trying to reach out, to explain, to ask for forgiveness. But some things can't be explained away, and some betrayals run too deep for simple forgiveness. Sometimes the only way forward is to accept what happened and focus on rebuilding your life from the pieces they left behind. Sometimes the truth comes from the most unexpected places. After that disastrous dinner, I spent days in a fog, barely eating, hardly sleeping. My wife hadn't come home, claiming she needed space to think. I was starting to wonder if I'd made a huge mistake, if I'd destroyed my marriage over what they kept insisting were just paranoid suspicions. That's when I got the call from Rob, a friend who worked at my wife's company. I hadn't talked to him much since everything happened. Most of our friends had gone quiet, probably trying to avoid taking sides. But what he told me changed everything. I've been seeing something for months now, he said, his voice hesitant. I didn't want to get involved, but after hearing about what happened at your house, I think you need to know. He told me about a small cafe downtown, one that was known for its quiet corners and discreet service. Every Wednesday, like clockwork, he'd see them there during lunch hour. My hands were shaking as I wrote down the address. Part of me didn't want to go. What if this was the final proof that would shatter whatever was left of my marriage? But I knew I'd never find peace until I knew the whole truth. The next Wednesday, I parked my car across the street from the cafe. The weather matched my mood, gray and dreary, with a light drizzle that made everything look blurry through my windshield. I felt ridiculous, sitting there like some character in a cheap detective movie, but I had to know. At exactly 12:30, Alex's car pulled into the parking lot. 5 minutes later, my wife walked in through the front door. They probably thought they were being clever, arriving separately. Through the cafe's large windows, I could see them choose a table in the back corner, partially hidden by a large plant. I sat there for an hour, watching them through my phone's camera zoom. The way they leaned in close to talk. How their hands kept finding excuses to touch. The familiar way she ran her fingers through her hair, a gesture I used to think was just for me. It was like watching a movie about strangers who happened to look like my wife and best friend. But the real gut punch came when they got up to leave. In that brief moment when they thought they were hidden by the plant, they kissed. Not a friendly peck, but the kind of kiss that told a story of familiarity and practice. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone, but I managed to capture several photos. I sat in my car long after they'd both left, staring at the images on my phone. Each swipe through the photos felt like ripping open a wound. There they were, in broad daylight, not even trying to hide anymore. All those late nights at work, all those gym sessions, all those client meetings. How many of them had been lies? The drive home was a blur. My mind kept replaying every moment when I doubted myself, every time they'd made me feel crazy for suspecting something. All those gaslighting conversations, all their perfectly reasonable explanations. They'd been playing me for a fool. I spent the next few hours going through old photos, text messages, and emails with this new knowledge. It was like putting on glasses for the first time. Everything that had been blurry suddenly came into sharp focus. The patterns were so obvious now, the matching stories, the convenient excuses, the way they'd coordinate their schedules. That evening, I got a text from my wife saying she'd be staying at her sister's place until things calmed down. I almost laughed at the irony. She wasn't at her sister's, and we both knew it. Instead of responding, I sent her one of the photos from the cafe. No words, no accusations, just the undeniable proof of what I'd been seeing all along. Her response came hours later. We need to talk. But for the first time in months, I felt no urgency to respond. The weight of uncertainty had lifted, replaced by a different kind of heaviness. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about the months of lies, the gaslighting, the way they'd made me question my own sanity. Looking at those photos now, I felt something shift inside me. The pain was still there, but it was different, cleaner somehow, like a broken bone finally set right. I had my proof. I wasn't crazy. And for the first time since this all began, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. You know that feeling when you're about to do something that will change everything? That's how I felt the night I decided to confront them both. I'd spent weeks planning this dinner at our house, making sure everything seemed normal. Just a casual Friday night get-together, like we'd done hundreds of times before. I remember standing in our kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, my hands shaking so badly I nearly cut myself twice. My wife was upstairs getting ready, humming some tune like it was just another normal evening. The sound made my stomach turn. How could she be so casual when our entire life was about to explode? The doorbell rang at exactly 7:00 p.m. Alex was always punctual, one of the things that used to make me admire him as a friend. He brought wine, like always, and gave my wife a quick hug that looked perfectly innocent to anyone who hadn't spent months noticing their every interaction. I watched as his hand lingered on her back for a fraction too long. The first hour was torture. We sat there making small talk about work, the weather, upcoming holidays, all these mundane things that seemed ridiculous given what I knew. I kept watching them, noting every glance, every slight movement. They were being extra careful tonight, keeping their distance, barely looking at each other. Maybe they sensed something was off. It happened during dessert. My wife had made her special chocolate cake, the one she usually only made for special occasions. I waited until they were both relaxed, 3 glasses of wine in, before I placed my phone on the table. "Funny thing," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I found some interesting messages on our old tablet." The change in their expressions was instant. My wife's fork clattered against her plate. Alex's face went pale. For a moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the ticking of our kitchen clock. Tick, 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 counting down the seconds until our lives changed forever. "What messages?" my wife asked, but her voice had that slight tremor I'd learned to recognize when she was lying. Alex was staring at his plate like it held the secrets of the universe, his knuckles white around his wine glass. I started reading some of the message previews I'd screenshot. With each one, the tension in the room grew thicker. I mentioned the coffee shop receipts, the matching hand cream, the hours at the gym that never added up. All these little pieces of evidence I'd gathered over months, laid out one by one on our dinner table like exhibits in a trial. That's when things exploded. My wife jumped up, knocking over her wine glass. Red wine spread across our white tablecloth like blood. "You've been spying on me," she screamed, but I noticed she wasn't denying anything. Alex tried to play peacemaker, which only made things worse. "Don't," I said when he started to speak. "Don't you dare try to explain this away. You were my best friend. I trusted you with everything." My voice cracked on the last word, and I hated myself for showing that weakness. The next few minutes were chaos. My wife was crying, switching between anger and guilt so fast it made my head spin. She accused me of being controlling, of driving her away with my suspicions. Alex tried to leave, but I blocked the door. "We're not doing this anymore," I said. "No more lies. No more gaslighting. I want the truth." But the truth, when it finally came, wasn't the clean confession I'd hoped for. Instead, it was more denial, more accusations, more attempts to make me feel like I was crazy for suspecting them. They were both experts at turning things around, making me question myself even when the evidence was right there. "If nothing's going on," I remember saying, "then show me your phone. Right now. Both of you." The look they exchanged in that moment told me everything I needed to know. Neither of them moved to reach for their phones. The evening ended with both of them storming out, my wife saying she needed space, Alex claiming I'd ruined our friendship with my paranoid accusations. I stood in our doorway, watching them leave in separate cars, at least maintaining that much decency. After they left, I sat alone in our dining room, staring at the mess we'd made. The overturned wine glass, the half-eaten desserts, the scattered evidence of my investigation, it all looked so small compared to the magnitude of what had just happened. I poured myself a drink and sat there until dawn, replaying every moment of the night, wondering if I could have handled it differently. But deep down, I knew this confrontation was inevitable. Some things can't stay hidden forever, no matter how carefully people try to conceal them. The truth has a way of demanding to be heard. They say the truth has a way of revealing itself in small pieces, like a puzzle slowly coming together. For me, those pieces started falling into place one rainy Sunday afternoon while my wife was at the gym, or at least, that's where she said she was. I was doing some cleaning around the house when I found our old tablet stuffed between the couch cushions. We hadn't used it in months, but it was still logged into her accounts. I know I shouldn't have looked, but something in my gut told me to check. That's when I found the messenger out, still logged in, with dozens of deleted conversations between her and Alex. Most of the messages were gone, but the preview snippets were still there. "Miss you. Can't wait to see you." Same spot as last time. Each message preview felt like a punch to the gut. Some conversations were deleted mid-thread, leaving fragments that painted a picture I couldn't ignore anymore. The photos were what really got to me. I started going through our recent group pictures, birthday parties, barbecues, weekend getaways. Things I hadn't noticed in the moment suddenly became crystal clear. In almost every photo, they were standing next to each other. Not obviously, but always within arm's reach. There were these little glances, these subtle smiles they shared when they thought no one was looking. I remembered our last group camping trip. While everyone was sitting around the fire, they'd volunteered to get more firewood together. They were gone for almost an hour. At the time, I'd brushed it off. The woods were dark, and maybe they'd had trouble finding dry wood. Now, looking at a photo from that night, I noticed how her hair was slightly messy when they returned, how his shirt had been buttoned wrong. The inside jokes started making sense too. Those little comments that seemed innocent at the time now carried different meaning. How they'd both laugh at things that weren't really funny, sharing looks that lasted a second too long. During game nights, they'd always end up on the same team, claiming they just worked well together. I started paying more attention to their social media interactions. Nothing explicit, but the pattern was there. He'd always be the first to like her posts. She'd comment on his photos with inside jokes. They'd check in at the same coffee shops within minutes of each other, even though they supposedly worked on opposite sides of town. One day, I noticed a small gift bag in her car. "Just some skincare samples from the mall," she said when I asked about it. Later that week, I saw the same hand cream on Alex's desk when I stopped by his office to drop off some documents. He quickly shoved it in a drawer when he saw me looking at it. The worst part was how they acted when confronted. Every time I brought up my concerns, they had perfectly reasonable explanations. They'd make me feel crazy for even asking. "We're just good friends," they'd say. "You're seeing things that aren't there." Alex would look hurt, telling me how he'd never betray me like that. My wife would get defensive, accusing me of trying to control who she could be friends with. But the evidence kept mounting. A coffee receipt from a cafe across town when she was supposed to be at work. A mysterious cologne scent in her car that matched what Alex wore. Her gym visits getting longer and longer, always on days when Alex happened to be there too. The way she'd get dressed up for what she claimed were routine work meetings. Their story started having small inconsistencies. She'd mention being stuck in traffic on the east side of town, while Alex would casually reference seeing her on the west side that same afternoon. They'd both get flustered when caught in these little lies, quickly changing the subject or making excuses. I started noticing changes in their behavior when we were all together. They'd be almost too casual, deliberately keeping their distance. But I'd catch moments. A lingering touch when passing drinks, meaningful glances during conversations, the way they'd somehow always end up in the kitchen at the same time during parties. The hardest part wasn't just the suspicion, it was the way they made me doubt myself. Every time I thought I had solid evidence, they'd have an explanation that made me feel foolish for asking. It was like they were experts at making me question my own reality. I knew I needed more concrete proof before making any accusations, but living with this knowledge, watching their careful dance of deception, was eating me alive. Every day felt like I was acting in a play where I was the only one who didn't know all the lines. Something had to give, and soon. Looking back now, I can pinpoint exactly when things started to change in our marriage. It wasn't like a lightning bolt or some dramatic revelation. It was more like those first few drops of rain before a storm. You know they're there, but you try to convince yourself it might pass. I never thought of myself as the suspicious type. My wife and I had been married for 6 years, and trust was never an issue between us. We met in college, dated for 3 years, and got married in a small ceremony surrounded by our closest friends and family. Among them was Alex, my best friend since high school, who'd been there through everything, my first breakup, my dad's passing, and even helped me pick out the engagement ring. The changes were subtle at first. My wife started working later than usual, which wasn't too strange given her recent